All right, good morning. How is everybody? We're going to talk about pre-press. Everybody excited? All right, very good, very good. Like I said, my name is Dirk Hiler. I am the Senior Vice President of Book and Directory Operations for LSC Communications, and Damon Lincourt works with us. He is our pre-press expert in our book and directory side of the business. And what we want to talk about is pre-press success in a multi-channel world. So 20 years ago, right, every file that was sent in was touched. That was the world that we lived in. Today, we heard about it from Mike and from others. It's about automation. It's about speed. Things need to go through quickly. And what Damon and I are going to talk about for a few minutes is what are the things that we can do in file preparation? How do we think about files so that as they go through different channels, whether that be digital printing or offset or, whether that's toner or inkjet, or if it's online, if it's ebook, if it's web-based, how can we prepare that file so that as it goes through the process, it doesn't slow things down and we can take advantage of automation? That's what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to talk about some tips. Damon's going to talk about most of it. But we'll talk about standards. You know, how do we use standards to keep things neutral? Who owns the file? Who controls the file? Where do you keep the file? And we'll talk about metadata because to speed things along, obviously metadata is a critical piece right now. So I'm going to talk for a couple minutes about value attributes. Stephen Covey said, "Start with the end in mind," right? So as we look at the production of a book, and you think about where is it going to be delivered, we obviously have to think about who are the end users, how is it going to get there, how are they going to find it, what's the usage going to be, and what are the attributes of that are the most important, right? Because we have lots of choices. We can do a lot of things, and if I think about the past, right, we're all used to the way things were done in the past, and things are changing and evolving rapidly. And what we want to do is we want to make choices as we prepare a title that gives the title the most successive chance, I should say, the most success in multiple different channels. And so as we think about some of these examples that are up here, you go back 20 years ago, right? Books were typically in bookstores or schools. And decoration was a big key. We wanted to attract users because with a highly decorated book, the adage was a book had 15 seconds in a bookstore to attract someone's attention. So cover stamping, embossing, die cuts, spot varnishes, those were all the rage and they're still used today. But what you have to think about is you have to think about what's the channel that this book is ultimately going to be in, and am I willing to set it up so that it's one thing in offset, another thing in digital, because in digital, the digital world, digitally printed books, many times it's about speed, it's about simplification, and some of those embellishments, while we're moving in that direction, slow things down. Or if it's online and you have an ebook delivery, really is a spot varnish, is a die cut really that important? So again, these are choices that we make as we plan projects, and we need to think through those. Pantone colors, great in the offset world for a 2-color book, right? You want something to look exactly a certain color. When it gets printed in the digital world, most digital presses, you've got the 4 colors, right? You're not going to get that exactness of a Pantone color. So is that really an attribute that's necessary as you prepare your file? And then another one is, Damon and I, we get the opportunity to work with many, many different customers and produce many, many books. We see many requests and many files, and we still get hey, it has to be just the right shade. This has to be dead on alignment. Those are the types of words that do what? Those are the types of things that slow things down, right? If you want dead on alignment and it's just going to be digital production, that's great. But as you design it and you create your file, if you put it together to be done in the offset world, those are the types of things that slow things down. So the point here is start with the end in mind. Think about those attributes that are going to be most important to your readers as you design and set up the product. And then as we go through it, how do we create files that only get touched a minimal amount of time and can be used in multiple different formats. That's what the objective is. So with that being said, I'm going to let Damon talk a little bit about standards.
Thank you, Dirk, and thank you to all of you. You've invested some time and attention this morning, and I very much appreciate that. I hope it's worth it for you. Standards, those things that we all tend to promote so that we know what we're going to ignore. Our idea here is to embrace those industry standards, though, those standards that can produce for us a channel-neutral book. Now, what do I mean channel-neutral? As we saw from the previous presentation, your title is going to have many different deliveries, many different forms over the course of the title life. So you want a channel-neutral file, something that is broad enough but standard enough that it can be delivered through any one of those different channels it's going to see throughout its life. So we encourage everyone to embrace these standards, such as delivered PDF files, delivered print-ready, truly print-ready, so that you can go directly to press, especially, for instance, in the digital inkjet or toner-based print model, delivered directly to press, fastest possible turnaround. We'd recommend also that you look at planning for a text-only file, text-only extraction from your file. That aids you with search engine optimization. Even if you might think, well, this book has no particular web delivery, that could be its discovery channel. It's also great for adaptive reading devices or those with adaptive reading needs. So plan on a text-only file and possible alternative text for images for those reasons. Now, if you know your title is headed for a web or app delivery, you could consider also tagging that content with one of several different XML standards. It's common for people to think, well, yeah, but that's for technical documents. No, honestly, these standards are meant to be broad enough that you could use for any number of different types of content. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. We're also going to encourage you to avoid the instance-specific color target. Now, what do I mean by that? I'll go into it a little more detail when I talk about color standards, but basically, you don't want the color to be just right on this press and on this stock if you know the life of that title is going to involve many different production means. We're also going to encourage you to consider those things that are actually merely conventions and not standards, not something that has to be this way or lends to efficiency by being this way. So let's get into standards of the delivered content file then. We strongly recommend the PDFX standard, and I've specifically called out the PDFX1A standard. The reason being, PDFX was created as a reliable blind exchange medium. Blind exchange means that your intent for the delivered product is absolutely clear and inescapable in the content. So the intent is in the content. You can hand it off with extremely high reliability that this is exactly how it will reproduce. Now the PDFX1A standard, you can see from the date on it, 2001, is actually a fairly old standard, but that's why it has such widespread adoption in various applications, widespread support in our software, and widespread support by different printers, different manufacturers. There are some features that PDFX1A specifically does not support, and I want to point out that it's a standard, it's not a file format. The PDF is the file format, and it can have different version levels of that file format. The PDFX1A is merely a standard, meaning that the file in that format meets these certain criteria. One of those criteria that it does not support is layers. But I'd like to encourage you all to consider that having layers in your content file is in fact not a clear statement of your intent. It leaves to chance, well, not to chance, but to instruction, the options for different types of output. And that's not consistent with what we said the blind exchange principle is about. The blind exchange principle is about what I hand you is exactly what will output. So not using layers in your PDF file is one way to make sure your content matches your intent. It's perfect for your layout application file, but not for your delivered content. There are a few other things that the PDF X1A standard does not specify. That includes things like geometry and trim box and so forth. It doesn't say what those have to be or even necessarily that they have to be enforced. I'll touch on that in a little bit more detail when it comes to metadata, but consider this. If you have not created proper and consistent, and I want to stress the part about consistent geometry within the file, it does not matter that the visual content goes to this point and stops if the software and if the machines cannot see that it stops at that point. The software and the machine only sees that it stops by the definition of certain internal parameters, trim boxes, bleed boxes, media boxes, etc. Now, in PDF X1A also, I want to point out that there is no support for native transparency, which was supported in later PDFX standards. You see the second most common standard is the PDF X4. Many people thought, wow, okay, great, finally I can have transparency in my files. The reason I would actually suggest PDF X1A as a broader and, let's face it, a little bit more dumbed down standard is the fact that by including a transparency, let me explain, also let me point out, my wife, Elizabeth, is very good at pointing out to me when I'm making incorrect assumptions about my audience. She's not here. So I'm going to count on all of you. I'm good with questions along the way, so if at any point I'm saying something and you're thinking, whoa, that doesn't make sense, or whoa, I have a question, please, go ahead, stop me then. So I was talking about transparency in your PDF, right? That is an attribute that allows you to say, okay, this object is on top of this object, but I want this much of this object to show through it. So the software supports that feature, but at some point during the output, you're going to be creating not a composite output like that, you're going to be creating a separation, right? You're going to be creating each individual color. So at some point, your software is going to say, I've got to write this much of this data into this layer. So one of the net effects of embracing transparency in your delivered PDF content is that you're leaving it to the device to correctly interpret and render that content into layers. And different devices, different software versions will render it differently. So again, we're recommending that PDF X1A standard because your intent is embraced in your content and is pretty much inescapable. Now, there are many good reference books available or reference white papers available for you for the PDF X1A standard. I've featured the cover of one of them there, PDF X in a Nutshell, available at pdfa.org. Many of you may also be familiar with the Ghent work group from Brussels. They're a good resource for PDFX standards. And because it is so widely embraced as a standard, you'll see that there are many websites and vendors who provide online pre-flighting to such standards, including one of our own, lscscout.com, to help you certify that your files are truly ready for print, ready for that blind exchange. One additional point that I want to make here, in the past, we may have recommended breaking up PDF files into single pages, and there are a variety of reasons for doing that. Again, this is not something that is necessarily specified in the PDFX standard, one way or the other. You can have single-page PDF files that are X1A compliant, or you can have a multi-page file that is compliant. We'd recommend making sure to keep all pages together in your delivered file, and here's why. One of the reasons for delivering single-page files, primarily was about bandwidth in the past. Everybody had a certain limitation on how much bandwidth they had outgoing or incoming, and so they wanted to keep things manageable in terms of file size. That's rarely a problem anymore. I think we all realize that bandwidth has become cheap and it's growing exponentially for everybody. But it should also be borne in mind that when you take your multi-page layout file and render it into single-page PDF file, suddenly you've destroyed one piece of the integrity. You've destroyed the sequential integrity of your original file. And if something changed on page 8, you might never see or understand why page 10 changed, because they are isolated from each other. I mentioned that it may be wise to plan your content for XML tagging, book tagging. Now, XML, we toss these words around very commonly without anybody necessarily having the deeper understanding. Even I don't have as deep an understanding as many in this business or many in this room. But XML tags are a way to convey the structure of a given document. By conveying that structure in a very formal way, following a schema, you're basically telling the system that receives it, here's what these tags mean, so that it can understand, here's the structure of my content. There are several different XML standards that exist within the book industry, including XBits and Onyx for transactions. So as I said, they can be used to convey the book's structure and content. They can also be used for conveying the book's metadata, its specifications. It can be used for conveying your book order information, which Onyx is targeted at. The most important thing to keep in mind is not necessarily whether or how those XML tags are used, but make sure if you are using them, you're embracing them in a way that is standard for the industry so that other software can use and understand those tags the way they are. Now we want to talk a little bit about standardizing your color space, and this is one of the areas where color, of course, is both craft and science in our business. So some people will fall more heavily on one side or the other, but in my case, I'm going to focus primarily on the science of color. I mentioned before that we're directing people to avoid device or condition-specific color profiles. It's not uncommon that a publisher may contact us to say, can you send me your color profile, your ICC color profile for this delivery, because they want to control their color that way. Such specific ICC color profiles target only specific press conditions, specific papers. It's an instance. And that's why it doesn't necessarily translate well when you're going to go to a different press, or if you're headed to inkjet and you have to make a change to your stock, whatever that might be. You're going to have an impact to the color at that point because you targeted something so specific that it is outside the gamut of other conditions. Many of you may have heard of the IDEA Alliance G7 protocol. It's an ANSI GATS specification. Now, again, it's important to understand that the G7 protocol doesn't describe the target color space. It references a target color space, which is within the gamut of any G7 managed press. And because the G7 protocol relies upon neutral gray values for its reference, your combination of colors to produce a neutral gray, it is better suited to being moved from one device or one stock to another, so long as you're going to achieve that same neutral gray value on that press. So in that respect, embracing the G7 protocol is a way of saying any well-managed press, digital, toner, inkjet, offset, whatever, should be able to reproduce that same color. So overall, the principle is to manage your color in a way that is not specific to an instance, not specific to a press or paper, something that can ensure reliable reproduction in different channels. Dirk made some reference to this earlier, too, with respect to spot colors. Again, remember that your title is going to have many different deliveries. Could be spot color in one instance, but process color in another, or it could be hexadecimal color values when you get onto the web, etc. So make sure you've considered how your palette is going to translate from one instance to another. I also want to talk a little bit about what genuinely constitutes a standard, something that we want to target because it is embraced by an industry and usable by other applications and other automations, versus what is, for us, convention. So for instance, the copyright and print code data that we're all familiar with, that standard format that you see there in green, countdown of the printing numbers, and the count of the printing years, that's actually just an old convention. And you realize that that's really just based on having put everything through film at some point in the past when we made plates from film, so that you could simply scratch off a number or opaque a number on your film when you went from one printing to the next. So it is a convention, we're all used to seeing it, but it's not necessarily, in fact, a standard that we have to embrace, because all it really is about is providing traceability, right? This is when it printed. This is the instance of the printing. And there are many different ways in our present modern manufacturing and CIPTA-aware world to have that traceability to the time and place of manufacture. I know publishers who use their PO number because they know they can always track that back to, okay, here's when I ordered it, here's where it manufactured. Or you may use date and time for the place of output, whether that's a printing plate for offset or if it's the actual output on your laser printer or dry toner press. So this traditional format that you see is based on being read by a human and understood by a human, but it does not easily support data automation. If you're going to require that this change for every instance it prints, and you're going to go to a digital platform where you're going to print perhaps 4 times in a week, you've added a human touch point that ultimately you're not going to want for that kind of rapid, quick turn delivery. So consider whether that convention is really necessary in your environment. Another convention that's common for us, and Dirk touched on this one, I believe, the composition of covers, right? Convention for us to say, okay, well, we've got the 2 panels, we've got the spine, let's put it all together, you put it in one layout. And for your layout, that might make very good sense, but remember, for your delivered content, it might not. Consider in your design the desirability of separating those into multiple parts. Because over the life of your title, again, you may make several different stock changes, resulting in some slight bulk difference from one printing to the next. By putting it into multiple pieces, you make it more practical for that spine to be adjusted to the bulk of the specific instance you intend to manufacture, the specific stock you're going to use. So digital asset management. You're the owner of your assets, right? And that's not just the content and the copyright and the reproduction rights, but it's also the digital files themselves. Every file that you ever sent to a printer was actually only a copy of an original file, right? You still retain the original. So treat that original as you would any other asset. It's inherent value to you. Be sure that you receive and you retain the original layout file, because that's what is genuinely intended for editing. You're the one who can keep it updated for every printing, and even if it is your vendor who keeps it updated, your composition vendor, your full service provider, make sure that it is yours, retained by you, and all alterations are done in the original rather than in the file you're going to deliver. Just as a terrible example, but we'll go ahead and use it anyway. If you delivered it to printer X, who has a plant in Oklahoma, and oh my gosh, it's wiped out by a tornado, suddenly you need to deliver it to printer Y. You don't want your corrections to that content file all resident at printer X. It's your asset. If you've owned it, you've got the only correct version of origin. So keeping the copyright, price updates, etc. It's in your interest to make sure you keep your asset updated that way. Another option to consider then, when it comes to generating files for reprints or reprints with corrections. Again, we have this convention of thinking, I'll only deliver those pages that have changed, right? But again, that gives you the pitfall that your content no longer necessarily matches your intent. You've added actually multiple stop operations, right? A single file is very efficient. You receive it, you process it, you place it, you rip it. But multiple page, single page files have to be placed and could be placed incorrectly or could have resulted in something reflowing from one page to another that you didn't anticipate. So again, for your reprint correction, just generating a completely new file for delivery. Speaking as just one printer, I guarantee you, we're receiving one file, processing one file, we know it has complete integrity, we're good with that. So there are many options that exist for digital asset management systems. I'm going to talk a little bit about actual storage of your assets too, because digital storage is one of those areas where Moore's law is still in effect. It keeps turning over and improving and getting more dense and cheaper, et cetera. So data storage is genuinely less expensive than it's ever been. Don't make the mistake of thinking that it is perpetual, though. You know, one of the effects of Moore's law is data technology keeps changing quickly, and that's true for your stored long-term data storage systems. Moreover, even some of those medium that we think of as highly reliable, whether that's a disk or a tape or something, actually they are subject to corruption also, right? So you're going to always want more than one copy of your asset. And I'd like to encourage everybody to start looking at cloud storage. In the graphs that you see there, that's basically showing you the projected cost per drive size. And you can see that it drops at an order of magnitude. Again, Moore's law in effect. But also down below, storage service prices. Basically, they followed the same path as your Amazon, Google's cloud storage services. They're following the same path, dropping price per megabyte. So that's what's going to really be able to support you keeping a local copy, but also a cloud-based copy. And the virtue of that cloud-based copy is you no longer own the cost of the technology turnover. The service you're buying owns that reinvestment of cost. Something to be aware of for using cloud-based storage, though, is that typically your greatest cost is in pulling that data out of the system, not writing it. It costs you one small fee to write it into a cloud storage, but it costs you incrementally more every time you pull it out. So if you're using cloud-based storage as the second tier of your storage, remember that you still want to invest in some sort of local work-in-process storage that's convenient for you to retrieve and modify when you want. Versions and reprints, touched on this a little bit when I spoke about reprints, but consider also, how many of you do produce books with multiple versions? Right, some of you do. It's really quite common in the education market, of course, but I see it also very commonly in trade and religious markets. And that's great in the layout file, right? Layers are perfect for creating specific content that layers on top of common content in your layout file. But that PDF delivered to print, you'll actually gain very little by having layers or version spot colors. It actually just introduces more processing work downstream before your product can be delivered. So consider delivering one PDF file for every version. After all, you're only going to truly print one version at a time on a press. Perform any color mapping or layer selection that's needed to create the output file. It still exists in your original file, so it's still much easier for editing on your side. But in the delivery, if your efficiency is going to be realized by plate change of a single color to create a different version, there's nothing about this that rules that efficiency out. That efficiency is still available, and without the additional processing beforehand that delays getting it to press. Likewise, on reprints, as I said before, consider supplying a single new file with all of your changes incorporated, because again, that single file can flow through automatically, no human intervention, and it better preserves the sequential integrity of the original. Metadata management. Metadata, all right, so that's the data about your data, right? It's not uncommon for us to forget, though, that the metadata, the data about your data, is one of your assets as well. The success in providing the data about your title, colors contained, trim sizes, any special treatments, inserts, etc., your success in delivering that data, along with content designed to realize that intent, is a key part of achieving manufacturing efficiency. Just-in-time inventory requires that sort of automation. There's no room for delay. Automation is better supported when you're supplying very consistent and very reliable metadata. Even if you're different systems, if your MIS and my MIS don't specifically talk to each other, don't actually have APIs or interfaces for talking to each other, it still leads to greater reliability if we can provide any sort of a structured data file that is reliable and consistent, produced from a machine, read by a machine. Control what data you're putting into each field to make sure it is the same throughout. It's not subject to different interpretation or different uses. One of my favorite complaints then about metadata received. Data does not really include text. Text is a very poor form of data. Human entered text is primarily human readable, not machine readable. And it's subject to too much variation to make it truly useful data for automation. So anything that you are accustomed to putting into your comments or your instructions means that you're telling somebody, stop, read this, and then act upon it. And when they stop and read it instead and then choose an action, you've introduced A, delay, and B, an option for a different interpretation. In your metadata systems, use data entry restrictions so it's impossible to enter invalid values. I've pulled a real-life example that we have been facing. We have a particular customer providing data on their titles, and they have a data field for the outside cover color, and they have a data field for the inside cover color. But because they didn't control the data entry, what's actually entered is 4/1 in just one of those fields. Now, human people like us, we can read that and understand, okay, that's 4/1 for the cover colors. But I can't feed that into a machine. To a machine, that's a date and not color information. So again, they did not use their data fields consistently, and they didn't control the entry to actual data. Whenever possible, it is best to transfer your data from system to system without human reading, without keyboarding, re-entry, even if it's only cut and paste into a spreadsheet. That's still far better than rekeying data. And after all, you can always write a macro, and a macro really could help you out a lot. So we've talked about several things here that we believe help you prepare a channel-neutral file, because we know we're living in a multi-channel world. Your title life is going to go through many channels as it exists, and frankly, as you saw from the earlier graph, your title life doesn't necessarily have an end point any longer. You may never go out of print on a title, given the option to produce just one copy at a time. So to maximize the value you're going to realize from your books, you want to make sure you're ready and available to use any possible production channel or delivery. So create that channel neutral file by recognizing the key value attributes that you know your customers are going to key off of, look for, act upon. Embrace the standards that help you to produce a very neutral file. PDF standards for content. Remember I said that it's blind exchange. Your content should absolutely contain your intent. Color standards. One of the many different XML standards that exist for structuring not just the content data itself, but also your spec information and your ordering data. Take ownership of your assets so that you always know you're delivering exactly the version that is current and the one you want. And then make sure you're delivering metadata for the book and the order that is consistent and reliable to support that automation. It's so critical in a fast-to-market world. And I think that brings us to the end of that, but also an opening for questions to either of us. Remember, my wife isn't here. I'm counting on you. Yeah.
More of a statement than a question. All of this makes sense, and it's something we try to preach on the manufacturing pre-press side to production, editorial design. But that is the biggest challenge for us. So if you're going to a POD model, you're using legacy files that existed in God knows what format. We need to deliver it to a POD vendor, and it is what it is. So where, as the industry changes, do we have, I don't know, accountability or partnership with these these printers to help us achieve the final intent and content? Because the file format may be that of, you know, I see on the education side these files with multiple layers, vector art, this and that. Final content on digital print looks horrible. So, you know, and then the business expects, like, well, why does it look this way when conventionally it looked this way? And we go in this circle of this is why they don't want to use digital printing.
Well, one of the first statements you made really should be one of the questions we're asking ourselves right now. It is what it is. Sometimes it is what it is because we did not clearly specify what the deliverable should be. Deliver layout files to your customer, right? Deliver every version. Or it can be because we haven't held each other accountable. And you're right, much of it comes down to accountability, but we haven't necessarily held each other accountable and said, when you deliver, this is what I have paid for and what I expect to get. So whether it's a file back from your printer, which you may be paying for, or it may be the file from your composition vendor or your designer, make sure you have set forth right there the standards of what you will receive for what you're paying. So that what it is, because yes, it is what it is, but what it is already suitable for multiple potential deliveries. If you're past that point, if your asset is already in a state of complexity, many vectors, many layers, etc., consider the investment that could be worthwhile, and the earlier discussion on total cost of ownership was an excellent example of that. It may seem we cannot afford to invest in this step until you begin to realize it will save you, let's say, 15 minutes of labor and expense on every single delivery after. And then you begin to realize, okay, that one-time investment is worth it, so I could perhaps take that complex original and render it out, or we sometimes call it normalize the file to any of several different deliverables and use those as your assets.
Hi.
Hi.
Would you just go back to the slide where you had the Moore's law computation?
Truly, it's not Moore's law that I
Okay.
showed, but rather
Shows
it is cost of digital storage.
Yeah.
Right.
The point I'd like to just ask you about is it's tempting to think, therefore, that you can scoop up all of this data
Yeah.
because it's so cheap to manage and control. But in truth, I would think that you need to invest in terms of the management of that data so that you are being very precise in terms of what you do want to store and what you want to delete, rather than just thinking it's a check that you can continue to write, because it becomes a cost over time that will be expensive to your corporation.
Yeah, I agree completely. And in fact, although the cost of the storage itself, as I said, drops exponentially, it is important to remember that there is still that cost, as I said, especially in cloud-based storage. There's the cost every time you're pulling that data out again, let alone the cost to write it in the first place. So there is cost, and you do want to establish efficiency. The other part of that efficiency you want to establish in terms of what you're retaining is version control. It is a terrible habit, but one that everyone seems to have, that they will keep multiple iterations of any given title. I gotta have this one, I gotta have this one, and they never overwrite or throw away anything. I do understand that instinct, but consider this. Not only does that give you added cost when you're going to go through any data movement or data translation, whether that's from one storage system to another or from one format to another, but it also gives you that cost and liability associated with making sure you're delivering the version you actually want printed, the one that is most current, that has everything needed. So if you're not selective in terms of your asset storage, you're right. You're creating redundancies and incurring more cost than you genuinely need to, but you are also incurring that risk and cost of managing your selection upon output.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Dirk and Damon. I guess the question is, how many times have you printed a file that said final, final, final? Is that just me? Sorry. Anyway, thank you guys. Appreciate it. That was awesome.
Thank you.